Hey guys, today I'm going to set the valve geometry on the 2-liter engine I'm building for my Bumblebee. I'm going to follow the guidelines Jake Raby wrote up, and later in this video, I'll speak with the air-cooled engine master himself. He left some comments on previous videos I did, positive amazingly, and I asked if he wouldn't mind giving some on-camera pointers to everyone, and me. So to begin, just like the other reused parts in this build, I sent the valve train out for machining and cleanup. In this case, to Tabari Andrade, who does a lot of engine work on the Samba. I'll put links to everything in the description, and of course, feel free to comment. I always try to answer ASAP. Here's some of the stuff I got back from Tabari, who most people just call the guy from the Samba. Basically what he did is he adapted my 2.0 rockers to accept swivel feet. So you'll see he did some machining in here, and he cut a little bit more of a pocket in there so that the swivel foot doesn't get bound up on stuff. He also took these blocks down a little bit. You'll see that they're no longer symmetrical. There's more meat on this side than there is on this side. He took these down, and the reason why is to make room for shims that will be on either side of the rocker with spacers obviously in between. These came from the Type 4 store, and these are the nuts, of course, for the swivel foot. These are 10mm swivel foots. The original Porsche ones are 8mm, and if you're a purist, you go with those, but then you need to find 1.7 rockers. You can't use your 2-liter rockers. And these shims are of varying sizes. So I've got 12 of the 40 thousandths, 14 of the 20 thousandths, another 14 of 11 thousandths, and then we get to 8 thousandths, and then just 8 of the 4 thousandths ones. They're really, really thin. Now what I'm trying to do with these shims is to get the rocker in a position where it's close to directly above the valve stem. I want it a little bit offset so it'll spin the valve stem as it works. You don't want it totally dead square on, but that's what these shims are for. Because if there's too many shims, it's going to be over here, it's going to be way off. Not enough, it'll be way off on the other side. There's a bunch of ways to do this. I've had these blocks machined down so there's more room for shims, but if you don't have them machined down, you can just put shims on either side of the spacer and then just lap the spacer, just take the width of the spacer down. That's another way to do it. Tabari mentioned that you always want to have a thick shim to the right of the rocker since the thrust of the motion pushes that way. Now it's a bit of trial and error with these. I already know that these shims put this rocker in the right position, so now I'm going to put some shims between here and here. I know I don't need a lot of space here, so I'm just going to go with thinner ones. And let's put this on the engine and see if this is lined up, and then we'll work on the shims to take up the end float. Okay, so now the shims are correct on this side and this side to keep this somewhat aligned with the valve stem, and this also, but there's a decent amount of play on this side, so I have to use thicker shims so that I won't have more than 4 thousandths of float in the whole assembly. And I know I've got the amount of free play right if I squeeze these blocks together, and I can make this tight. Alright, so this is my 4 thousandths feeler gauge. You can see it kind of fits in there pretty good. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to squeeze these blocks tight. Tighten them down a little bit to the point that this thing can't move, which is right. Now when I pull this out, it will have 4 thousandths. There it is. So that's what it's got. Doesn't seem like a lot, but I guess that's enough. First thing we're going to do is make sure that everything is clean. So into the parts bath ultrasonic cleaner, everything goes. And just in case you're wondering, hey, what kind of dirt could come off of new parts? Well, take a look at that water. Enough to make the water dirty. That's why you clean. This right here is how I know it's clean. Use a white rag, and it's still white.
So now we'll start to assemble the valve train. Put a little oil here, and then just slowly build things back up the way I test fitted them before, with all the proper shims and spacers as well. And here we have one cylinder complete. Next step is to grab a lifter and put some engine assembly grease on it, and then drop it into the engine, of course with the cup side facing out. And just push it all the way down there. Now I'll make sure that the notch on the blocks is facing towards the bottom, because the retaining wire is going to need to fit into that. To set the valve geometry, you'll need an adjustable push rod. I made this one from the same rods and ends I'm using in the build. It's important to test with the same parts so the measurements carry over identically to the final push rods. Now Jake in his write-up recommends starting with a length of 27.1 centimeters or 271 millimeters. Gotta love how the metric system is so easy to do those calculations. He says that the final length will be within 5 millimeters of that. Now I'll rotate the engine so I'm at top dead center on cylinder 1, which means the valves are closed and there's no load in the rockers. Now I'll take my adjustable push rod here and get it ready to go.
What I'll do is set the push rod back into the recess of this, and then lift this up so that I can get this into the cup of the intake. That's the first one that I'm going to be working on. And then I'll just temporarily put some nuts on here just to hold this down. It's eventually going to get wavy washers. So now what I have is loose zero, which means that it's tight to the top of the valve stem, but I can still spin the rod pretty easily. And this is loose zero because these are chromoly rods. If they were aluminum, then the spec would be whatever, 4 thousandths or 6 thousandths in the engine. Now I'll set up my dial gauge to do the actual measurements. I like to use a digital one so I don't have to squint at a needle.
Mine has a magnetic base, so I made a plate to go over the intake to keep it secure.
And the thing to make sure with this is that it's parallel to the plane of the valve stem, that it's not tilted in or tilted back, because that could also throw off the readings. You want to make sure that it's sitting right on the edge and that it's straight up and down. You can see it from this side here. It might be a little bit off. That's better.
The card that came with my cam shows that the lift should be 426 thousandths on the intake side, also on the exhaust, but this is what I'm aiming for now.
All right. See what our max is. 413, 416. Looks like 416 is our max lift there. Okay, so that's not too bad. We're in the ballpark, but this is only the first pass. So now we have to figure out if there's more to be had by extending this push rod or shortening the push rod and extending the swivel feet. It's a bit of a balancing act to try to go back and forth, but that's what this is all about, and that's why it takes so long. You want to get as close as you can to the actual lift in the cam guide. Okay, let's see what happens if we make the push rod a little bit longer. So what I did is I lengthened the push rod a little bit. Let's see what that did. 409, 410, 414, 16. Seems that that's probably it. Yeah, 416 is the max we got there. So
Well, lengthening didn't have much effect, so let's try shortening the pushrod.
Okay, now I've shortened the pushrod so it's a little bit loose in there, which means I have to take up the slack here on the adjuster. So just loosen that up. I'll tighten this down a little bit and snug it up so it doesn't move. Yeah, and that's pretty much a loose zero. Let's see how that goes now. Let's have it come on lobe. Here it comes. Okay, we're at 416, 418, 19, 21, 22. That's pretty good. Now it's headed back on the other side. So 422, that's not bad. So we're finally headed in the right direction. But before I call it done, I'm gonna play with the adjustments and see if I can get the full 426 lift. Okay, it's starting to go down. Now, let's see how high we get. We're at 404, 410, 420, 424 and a half, 425, 425 and a half, ooh, 426. Okay, so we have good lift. Now we have to check the geometry, which is done at exactly half the lift. So in my case, 213. Let's see, yep, now it's going down. That is perfect. So half of 426 is 213. So now we're just going to take this to half the lift, 213. And let's see how our valve geometry looks. Okay. Now you see how the top of the valve and the foot and the adjuster seem to be in a straight line. That's what we're going for here. Like a straight line from here all the way down. That means our geometry is in line. Now, if the geometry wasn't good here, I'd have to go back and play with the length to achieve the highest possible lift with good geometry. Sometimes shims are needed under their rocker assembly to get everything to line up. Jake Raby says it's more important to get good geometry than every last millimeter of lift, and we'll find out why in a minute. I had the good fortune to speak with him in the middle of this process, and here's some of our conversation. Well, Jake, thanks so much for joining in and paying attention to my videos. You know, when I found that you were watching them, I was like, oh man, it's like the professor looking at your work.
Man, I tell you, you've done a great job, though. I mean, and the thing is, you know, you go back and look at the old video I did 21 years ago, and the fact that we couldn't even put it on DVD at that point. You know, it had to it had to take a couple of years to get it to that point, and then you see what you've been able to do there in your garage just with a couple of simple devices, and it's just proof of how far things have come. But you've done a great job. I mean,
Thanks, man. Well, I've been having a fun time working with this, as you've seen on the videos. And now I'm about to start with the valve geometry, which is interesting. You know, what's funny is I followed your suggestions that you had in the write-up that you had done. And Jake, I think I just got really, really lucky because I put it in and then I made a few little adjustments. And I think I think within like 10 minutes I got it set, which doesn't seem right to me, but it's possible.
Probably ended up being pretty close to a 27.1 centimeter long push rod. If you pull that out and measure it, I bet you're really close to that. And the thing is, doing an engine like yours, and we can go over the variables that play into what makes it more difficult to get these numbers right the first time.
Mm-hmm.
The more things that vary from stock, the farther out you're going to be. The cam you're using is very mild. It has a base circle the same as stock. Those things play into it. You know, you've decked a little bit off of your crankcase. That's another thing that plays into it because you're changing the distance from the center line of the rocker shaft to the crankshaft.
Yeah.
That center line got a little bit smaller. But when you start stroking things, right, and you end up putting big thick spacers into the cylinders, and you know, all of that really matters. The further out you're moving the center line of that rocker arm compared to the center line of the crankshaft, the more that makes things become complicated. Also what you've got for a fly cut on the cylinder heads, those are new head castings, right?
Yep.
So that means that you have a stock cylinder deck. If anything, Lynn just probably took a couple thousandths off of them. But people that have 50-year-old heads that have been fly cut, 10 times while the engine's been rebuilt, every time you do that, the center line of that rocker arm is getting closer to the center line of the crankshaft.
And that's changing up the geometry. Yeah.
But with the geometry stuff, it's common sense, because ultimately the thing people watching the video need to understand, the reason this is important is because this is what dictates wear. It also is what dictates how smooth and quiet the engine's going to run. Because if the valve train, which is the weakest part of this engine, any engine that has push rods, the valve train is the weakest part. If you don't get this right, you end up in a scenario where you're putting undue side loading on the valve stems, on the valve guides. You're putting undue stress on the valve adjusting screws. You're putting undue stress on the cam and lifters. All these things are playing into it. So ultimately, like in that old article of mine that you read that I did back in 2006, I believe it was, I think there was 11 things that are in there that play into this equation of what your rocker arm geometry is going to be. And with those, we've already went over a lot of them, but if you don't get it right, then you end up wearing out the valve guides at the end of the day. That's the main thing. Or you end up with an engine that you constantly have to adjust the valves on. The valve adjustments don't hold, and the engine runs louder, and it's going to wear. So it's important. But if you follow that video, you follow that article, and follow what you're going to show in your video, I'm sure, which I haven't seen yet, obviously, but you're going to hit the high spots. And, ultimately, if you get the overall goal is two things. You want to get maximum valve lift, okay? And you want to end up with, when you're at 1/2 that net valve lift, let's say you're shooting for 500 thou lift, your cam's good for 507, you got 500 out of it. At 250 thousandths, you want the stem of your valve to be totally in alignment with the valve adjusting screw at 1/2 net valve lift. And if you get there, great. And of course, obviously, I try to zero out my adjustment on my valve adjusting screw when I start with that. That way I got adjustment both ways, in and out, over time. Next, you'll do your exhaust side. You're going to learn you probably can't get more than like 412, 415 out of the exhaust if you're lucky. That's usually about all you can get out of it. And you're probably going to find that you need to have a push rod that's a couple of tenths of a centimeter longer or shorter sometimes than what you have now. Usually it's longer. So when you do the exhaust side, that's something to keep in mind.
Thanks so much to Jake for taking the time to help a newbie builder like me, and maybe you too. If you'd like to hear our full hour-long conversation, please join my Patreon. The link is in the comments below. Okay, now back to the engine.
Now being careful not to lose my setting here on the adjustable push rod, I'm going to take off this block, this assembly up, and get it out of the way a little bit, just temporarily, so that I can pull the push rod out and go measure it. So that intake push rod measures 269.29, and that's what we'll have to cut the other ones to fit.
I'll show you how I cut these after we measure up the exhaust side. So now I'll just do the same thing with the lifter and the lube on the exhaust side. Push it right in.
Let's take the push rod and we'll find a way to get it into the lifter, make sure that it's in the cup of the lifter. And now we'll raise this up and get the top of that into the cup of the rocker. Now when you're putting the push rod in, you want to make sure that this block is against the head and it's not sitting up proud. If this is a little too long, it'll throw this up just a little bit and your readings will be completely off. So the combination of screwing these in and shortening the push rod should get you to a place where this is all the way down and you can still lift this back and forth, which means it's not pushing on the push rod. So this is loose. You can see that it's loose. And now what I'll do is I'm going to turn the adjuster until it's snug. Yeah, that's as far as it goes. And you'll see that I can still turn the push rod. That's loose 0. And now we'll get a nut on this adjuster here so it doesn't move while we're going through the process. So let's see what this exhaust valve is looking like after the adjustments. It's going up to, I got it to 404. That's about it. 405 maybe. I'm playing with the rod length here, trying different lengths to get the most lift.
So we see the valve go down and the numbers go up, and I reach 413.
Well, once again, Jake was right. I was only able to get 413 on the exhaust. And since he said I'd be lucky to get that, I'll consider it like a 20 in blackjack and stick.
And the geometry looks good here. It looks just like one continuous straight line.
So once again, we'll take this off, we'll pull the rod, and we'll measure it.
And it looks like I'll need 270.59 for the exhaust.
To figure out how much to cut off the push rods, I measured the tip and the tiny gap below it and subtracted that from the target length, which for these was 260.79 millimeters.
Okay, now the name of the game is to cut all the push rods to the right length. So I know that I want the push rod without the tip to be 260.79 millimeters, and I've set the lock screw here to make sure that it doesn't move. And that's one that I already finished. So what I'm going to do is make a mark here, and it's going to be a little bit long so that I can sand it and get it into the right ballpark rather than cut it too short and possibly miss it. And the way I'm going to cut this is using one of these tube cutters, or archery cutter, whatever you want to call it. So I have my mark here, and I'm going to slip it into the device, get it closed down kind of right in the middle of the black mark, which is what I set. And that's pretty much it right there. All right, and then I just spin this around. It's easier in a vise sometimes. Just spin it around and then tighten it every once in a while as it cuts into the tube. Just got to keep tightening. Easier to see from the top down.
Now you can get a powered archery cutter to do this much faster and more precisely probably too, at like a Cabela's or Bass Pro Shops.
Almost. Oh, and there it is. Clean cut. So you can see that it's probably maybe a couple millimeters, maybe 3 too long. That's fine. Better too long than too short. And we'll trim it up. Got some glass here and some wet dry 120 grit. There's a lot of back and forth.
And I'm doing this on a piece of glass to keep things just perfectly flat.
Well, after a lot of sanding, there it is. Fits perfectly in the slot.
Now I'll shoot some brake cleaner through the hole here to get rid of any residue from sanding.
Now to finish the job and put a tip on the end of the push rod, I'm going to use an old lifter and put the bottom piece in there, and then the new piece, the new tip on top, And then another old lifter, because the cup will be exactly the right radius.
Now I'm using a mini sledge here to pound this in, and you need a fair amount of force to get the tip to seat fully into the pushrod. And there we go, a finished pushrod. You'll also want to make sure that you roll these on a flat surface to make sure that there's no bowing in them. And then maybe use a little engraver to label the intake ones and the exhaust ones so you don't get them confused.
Next, I'll put the pushrod tubes in and finish the top end of the engine. Please subscribe so you can see what happens when I turn the key for the first time. I can't wait to do that. Thanks again to Jake Raby for being so generous with his time and expertise, and to 914 Rubber for making so many great parts in this build. There are links to everything in this video in the description below, and please add comments or questions. I'll get back to you ASAP. Please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and be safe and enjoy.